Tech team. All right, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Munn, for our next talk. Go ahead, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to share our research at this great event. It's wonderful to see such great turnout. So I'm Jonathan Munn. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Guelph with the Morwick G360 Groundwater Research Institute. And I'll be sharing some research that we're doing using fiber optic sensing to try and get some insights into groundwater flow in the Guelph area. It's very much a team effort, so I just wanted to acknowledge some of the co-authors and other folks involved in the studies. Dr. Beth Parker, the director of the Institute, Carlos Maldiner, Jonathan Kennel, and Pete Pemme, who are part of the scientific staff or PIs with the group, and then Mitchell Brown and Hemedre Zadanek, who have been involved in this fiber optic research as graduate students, either former or current. And of course, the funding sources down at the bottom right of the slide that make this possible. So the challenge that we're trying to address here is the fact that measuring natural gradient flow in these bedrock aquifers is very challenging. And we might drill a borehole through this carbonate aquifer in the city of Guelph or in other areas, and we might intersect hundreds of fractures, 200 fractures, and trying to distinguish which fractures are significant in terms of groundwater flow or contaminant transport can be really difficult. Many of the devices or tools that are available for use are either designed for unconsolidated deposits, or they're designed to be used in open boreholes, measuring vertical flow, and we know that that's not necessarily reflective of flow through the aquifer system. And so this talk will show how we're starting to develop some of these fiber optic sensing methods to try and provide some insights into which fractures or other porosity features matter. So for those that aren't familiar with distributed sensing, it's a fiber optic technology that's just commercially available, but we install these fiber optic cables in boreholes. Let's see if there's a laser pointer here that it's kind of hard to see. But we can install these fiber optic cables in these bedrock boreholes right there, and we can seal these boreholes with flexible borehole liners. These flute liners, these inflate with water and seal up these boreholes temporarily. So it restores the natural flow conditions around this borehole. And the fiber optic sensors can connect to these fiber optic cables and allow us to measure a continuous temperature profile along that borehole length. And so in this cartoon, this might be represented by this blue line here. And then to identify where groundwater is moving in the subsurface, we can start to heat that cable with integrated heating wires, and with the idea that where you have active groundwater flow occurring, it's going to dissipate the heat in that depth faster than zones without groundwater flow. And so that would be this heating scenario, and we can use the fiber optic sensor to identify, these thermal anomalies. And we'll get into a bit more detail in a few slides here. So some fairly old field photos now just showing the installation of one of these fiber optic cables in a borehole at a research site in the city of Guelph, and then the flute liner going in on top of that. You can see the fiber optic cable coming out from behind that flute liner. So once again, the purpose of that is just to seal up the borehole so we don't have any flow within the borehole itself. We generally log out of a trailer, so all the equipment is in one of these little cargo trailers that we have a generator that can power the whole system. The fiber optic sensor is right there, that little white box. We have a power controller that allows us to regulate the amount of heat output along this cable, and then a cutaway of the cable assembly, just to show that the cable itself contains these optical fibers. They're very small, but you can see these little colored fibers. This is what allows us to measure temperature along that cable. And then we have these heating cables, these two copper wires that we use for heating the cable. So to get into a little bit of the data analysis about how we use this temperature to measure flow, we can start thinking a little bit about thermal conductivity. So if you were to take a bedrock aquifer with no groundwater flow and you were to drill a borehole and you were to measure the thermal conductivity of that rock all along that borehole length, you might get a profile that looks something like this. And the thermal conductivity of this is maybe affected by the mineralogy of the rock, the lithology or the porosity of the rock. And this represents basically how fast heat can pass through this material through conduction through the rock matrix. But we know that in these aquifer systems, we have varying amounts of groundwater flow through these either fracture networks or other porosity features. And if you were to repeat that test with the influence of this groundwater flow, you would see that you have localized zones of enhancement in this thermal conductivity. And this is why we call this an apparent thermal conductivity profile. And this is basically what we're measuring with this fiber optic sensing. We have both the bedrock and the groundwater components. And so if you can constrain what this no flow condition, this rock thermal conductivity is, and we can measure this blue baseline with the DTS system, we can then identify where we have these zones of enhancement. We might have kind of more gradual flow or very obvious flow zones and enhancements. So to constrain that no flow, the rock baseline is fairly straightforward. We typically core these boreholes, and so we can take samples of the rock core. This is an example. We would subcore these samples to get a fairly reasonably detailed profile of effective thermal conductivity, and we can take these samples to a lab and get lab measurements of the rock core. So this happens to be a divided bar apparatus with a Geological Survey of Canada. Their facilities in Calgary. And you can see on the left there, this would represent the thermal conductivity of the profile without any sort of groundwater flow. So if we go back to this cartoon here, this blue line, which includes the effect of conduction and convection from groundwater flow, this is what we're measuring with the A-DTS method. So this is a fairly quick talk, and I won't go into too much detail here, but to give you a quick sense of how we analyze the data, on the plot on the left represents the temperature output from one of these active tests. This would be a 10-hour heating test. On the y-axis, we have depth here, so this would be the top of the water table. This is the bottom of the borehole. And on the x-axis, we have time, so this is a 10-hour heating test, and then the colors are contoured to correspond to the temperature. So you can see some obvious zones where we're having preferential heat dissipation in the center there. So each one of these depths, we have data output about every 12.5 centimeters along this profile. So we can take every single one of these depths and look at the heating rate. So that would be an example of a single depth, say 20 meters. And we can look to see how fast that portion heats up as we heat this cable. And without going into a ton of detail, the rate of temperature increase, or the slope of this line, is proportional to the thermal conductivity. And so if we do this for every single depth throughout that borehole, we can start to generate fairly detailed profiles like this blue line here. And it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but you can see the rock baseline, this dashed line in the background. That's the rock thermal conductivity, and this blue line is the profile, including the groundwater flow. And so this is how we're going to be looking at the results in this presentation, just looking at these thermal conductivity profiles. We have gone one step further to estimate flow rates through these fractures, but it involves kind of a whole nother level of complexity and some numerical modeling. So we're going to stick with these thermal conductivity plots because it's quite visual where groundwater is occurring and the relative amount of groundwater flow. So some of the research questions we were trying to address with this work in the Guelph area is what types of porosity control flow. As Abigail just mentioned, there's all kinds of different porosities. There's vuggy porosity, fracture porosity, and so on. So which types are important in terms of groundwater flow? What's the magnitude and direction of flow in this bedrock aquifer? And then how does this flow vary with time? So how does the seasonal changes, the snow melts, the precipitation and recharge events, pumping changes, how does this affect the bedrock system? And so we developed a bit of a long-term experiment at our research site on the University of Guelph campus. You can see the little inset map is the campus here, and we're just up in the Arboretum in the north part of the campus. And this borehole cluster was drilled about 10 years ago, largely funded by the Ontario Water Consortium, but it has 6 vertical boreholes and 3 incline boreholes around the outside to study this aquifer in detail. Again, this goes through the full Silurian sequence in the Guelph area. And we did a long-term experiment in the center borehole here highlighted in red, this GDC5 borehole, where we conducted 25 24-hour A-DTS snapshots throughout a duration of about 14.5 months, so almost bi-weekly, where we did these A-DTS tests. And then we also had lots of other instrumentation at the site. So we monitored hydraulic head at 12 different depths throughout this sequence in 4 different boreholes, so we can start looking at hydraulic and vertical gradients as well to try and link the hydraulic response to the flow response that we're measuring. And the idea here is again to get some temporal data to see how this flow is changing throughout this period. And to set the stage a little bit, this is the lithostratigraphy from that GDC5 borehole on the left there. You can see we have primarily the Aramosa, Goat Island, and Gasport formations. There might be a little sliver of Guelph at the top here, but we might need to get Frank Brenton out to take a look at that core to help us distinguish that. But you can see plotted beside that, we have the transmissivity distribution along that borehole, those black bars. The laser pointer doesn't seem to work very well, at least I can't see it very well. This is the transmissivity distribution. So those black bars represent 1 foot intervals with transmissivity. So you can see, just to give you a sense of, there's a little bit of transmissivity along that full borehole, but there's certainly these strong features with much higher transmissivity. So we'll go through some ATV, some acoustic and optical televiewer images to get a sense of what porosity features are there. So you can see in this uppermost unit here, this is the highest transmissivity in all of the boreholes across the site. This fracture that you can see in that image is laterally extensive and is present in all of the boreholes. It's quite a large aperture, and you can see that response in the transmissivity data. If we go down to that other spike that we see in the Ancaster member of the Goat Island Formation, we have these two main fractures with perhaps some smaller fractures above each of those. And once again, these are laterally extensive. We can see these fractures in all of the boreholes across the site, and we'll see that they're important in terms of flow. And we also see a pretty significant head loss. There's only about a meter between these two fractures, and we see about a 4 or 5 meter head loss across those two fractures. So this little 1 meter layer seems to be serving as a fairly effective aquitard in this area. And then if we go down to the gasport formation, this is generally, if we were to see some substantial dissolution or karst features, this is where we would typically see it down in the center of the gasport. You can see these two somewhat smaller transmissivity responses. This one seems to be associated with a fracture up at the top, and perhaps some of this porosity. It looks like there's lots of moldic and perhaps some vuggy porosity here. And then some actual karst channels that we see. This site we actually did encounter about a 2 meter cavern in one of the boreholes. Okay, and so here's some of the results from these long-term experiments. I kept the transmissivity and lithostratigraphy up there for reference. Once again, as a reminder, this is the A-DTS output. So this black line that you see is the no-flow baseline. The red line represents the A-DTS thermal conductivity. So anything to the right of that black line corresponds to flow. So you can see we measured a small amount of flow along the full profile, but you can see there are certain depths, specifically in this Ancaster member, where we see a really strong amount or high flow rates associated with those two fractures. Interestingly, we don't see at certain times of the year a really strong amount of flow occurring in this big open fracture at the top of the Vinemount member here, but perhaps a bit of elevated flow in this reformatory quarry member. Off to the right, this is our weather data. The text is very small, apologies, but this is the temperature throughout this 14-month period, precipitation, and this is the depth of snow on the ground, just to give you a sense of how the weather is changing throughout these snapshots. And again, this is a fairly quick talk, so I'm going to flip through these fairly quickly. I don't have time to talk to each snapshot. But as you see, as we progress through, the previous snapshots stay on that plot as a gray bar to give you a sense of the variability that we see. But you can get a sense of, at certain times of the year, we see very strong amounts of flow in this Ancaster member. And then, 2 months later, we see something very different where there's very little flow occurring in that Ancaster member, but all of a sudden up in the shallow zone here, we see substantial flow occurring in that big fracture. So really variable flow at different times of the year. And it goes to show you, if you were just to go do 1 or 2 snapshots of this, how different of a picture you can get from these type of tests. So we'll just fairly quickly flip through the rest of the snapshots here. Things quiet down quite a bit in the fall and winter of 2022 and 23, and you can see things start picking up again in the spring. And so I'll just sit right here just to give you a second to look at where we see a lot of variability. You can see a fair amount of variability just throughout the whole gasport formation and a lot of the profile, with certainly much more variability observed at these highly transmissive fractures or other features. And the idea here is to take some of these, these measurements and the insights that we're gaining from this and using it to help piece together the conceptual site model for this local area, and then ideally for the larger Guelph area, to try and learn how these different features may be affecting the flow system. And so this was a cross section that was developed a few years ago for part of my PhD research. And if we were to overprint the results of those snapshots on top of this, you can see it starts to align with some of these features within this bedrock system, and we'll go through here. So we'll start off with this upper unit here. This is where we saw that big fracture that's laterally continuous across the site. And we know from hydraulic head and the DTS data that flow in this upper portion of the aquifer is to the north. And so if you look to the north of this research site, at the same elevation of that fracture is the Aramosa River. And so it appears that the shallow bedrock has hydraulic connections to some of the surface water bodies nearby. And then as we work our way down in this profile and we get down to this other flow zone here that we identified in the Ancaster member, we see in both the hydraulic head and the DTS data a really drastic change in flow directions. And by the time you get to the base of the Vinemount member and in the Ancaster member, we see flow towards the south. And to the south of the site is one of these big buried bedrock valleys that Abigail was mentioning. And we think there may be connections to the base of that valley and this rubble layer to some of these depths in the Ancaster here. So really, potentially some really complex connections to some of these geological features. And then we mentioned already that the Ancaster appears to be an aquitard here, and then down in the gas port, this is going to be primarily affected by the municipal pumping. So I think I'm pretty much out of time here, but just wanted to summarize here the fact that these tests are giving us some insight into where the groundwater flow is occurring and how this changes through time and how it might be connected to some of these geological features on the site. We see most of the flow occurring at some of these fractures, but we do see evidence of flow in some of these dissolution features as well, or some of these karst channels. Yeah, so thanks very much. I think that's all I have for today. I did want to put a plug out there that I am looking for graduate students. So if you're finishing up your undergrad degree, please feel free to reach out if you're interested in this type of work. So thanks very much.
I think we might have a minute for questions if anyone has any questions. John, got a question at the back here. Oh, we got a mic coming, sorry. Be easier for everyone to hear.
Just a quick question about that thermal conductivity of the rock units themselves. Is that fairly consistent from borehole to borehole so that you could essentially kind of apply that same curve in all the boreholes in an area? We've
been trying to collect much more data. So we have most of the thermal conductivity from this site. And so the lithostratigraphy of this site and the geology it's a fairly small site. So we have been able to translate it from borehole to borehole. But we are working on getting more data so that we can get some more data for each of these kind of geologic members and formations, so we can start to compile and perhaps generate some profiles. So because the geology changes quite a bit, I'm not sure you could necessarily copy and paste that profile, but we are trying to build up a bit of a data set so we can help and inform if we were to apply this at another site where we don't have core, what the rock thermal conductivity might be.